So today we're going to set up a service principal in Azure. We're going to be setting up the service principal for a GitHub secret and for an Azure pipeline. So we will set up a service principal and put it into both DevOps processes. So the first thing we're going to do is create a service principal. And just so you understand what a service principal is a Azure user that allows you to run processes or authenticate to Azure Active Directory as that user. So it's like an unattended user used for doing automation in the cloud. So we'll first create a service principal via the portal. So I'll show you how to do that in the portal real quick. You can come into here and click on Azure Active Directory. Now you may or may not have permissions to do this, so sometimes a IT admin will do this. But what will happen is they will actually perform this, and you will be given the keys and the secrets so you can use the service principal, or sometimes they might actually register the service principal inside of your pipeline or your GitHub Actions or secrets for you. So if you go to app registrations, we'll click a new registration, and then we'll give it a name. We're going to call this, I think I called it Databricks DevOps Action. So should name this something that makes sense. And then we're going to do just this single tenant and the URL, which we don't really need. It will just default to something, but that's an optional creation. So we have created a service principal, and let me close these down here. And you'll need a few pieces of information. You need a client ID, so this is basically the user ID. We'll need the tenant ID. So this is the Azure Active Directory. So when we say we want to authenticate this user, this client, we have to say against which Azure tenant we want to authenticate. And then we're going to need a password. So you'll click on Clients and Secrets, and then you'll come down here and you'll say New Secret. And then you can choose the expiration. So we can choose this DevOps, and you could say Never, and we'll hit Add, and then you'll get a one-time secret value. I'll be deleting this secret after the video, but you can actually copy this password. So over here we have a couple pieces of information. We're going to have the secret. We're going to have the other pieces we need here is from the Overview tab. You'll need the app client ID. So you'll get the client ID. And, oops, I spelled that. And you also need the tenant. Oops. So we need the tenant. So now that we have those three pieces of information, we can actually authenticate into Azure. So we'll create a secret in a second in GitHub, but those are the pieces of information you'll need. So once you've created this user, the service principal doesn't have access to anything in Azure. So what you'll need to do is you'll have to assign security to this. So if you wanted to take quote unquote the easy route, you could go to your subscriptions and you would hit access control, and then you would do a new role assignment here, and you'll be able to pick a role. So you could say contributor, and then we would search for that. I think it's called Databricks DevOps Action. And what this would do is actually grant access to the subscription, which is very high level privileges, to this user. So typically you won't be doing this unless you're in your own subscription. So now this user could have full control of your subscription. So I'll show you in a second how to limit that access, but let's go ahead and use this service principal to create a GitHub secret. So over in GitHub, you're going to come over here and click on Settings. You're going to go to Secrets inside your repo, and then my secret was called Azure Credentials, so I'm not going to create a new one, but I'll create a all the way up to the save point. So Azure Credentials, and then you need some JSON. So over here you would need this client ID. You're going to need to replace this client ID here like this. You need the tenant. So the tenant you would replace here, and you would need the secret, which is here, and we'll put the double quotes back, and then you need the subscription ID. So If you don't have the subscription ID, it's under subscriptions. It's listed throughout the portal, but you should be able to find it either there or under the actual um, service principal that you created. So then this is now creating your GitHub secret, and you would paste this in here. So that's the JSON you need, and you would click Add Secret. So I'm just going to call this number 2 just for testing purposes since I already have one. And now we have the credentials that GitHub can use to call over to Azure. So the name of the secret is what will be referenced in your pipeline. So I'm going to remove the one I just created because I have one already created. And then to get the JSON, let's say, for instance, you wanted to get this JSON fully, you can run this command here, which would create a secret with, I'm going to call it number 2, since we already have one. So if I copy this command, which will give it a contributor role to my subscription, if we come over back to the portal, and we are going to start a Cloud Shell, and this would just be bash, and we can paste this, and this will do the same exact thing we just did, which will create a service principal. It will give it a subscription contributor role, so it's creating it, and then we'll take a look at what it does. So you can do this either command line. The benefit of this approach is it does give you the JSON that you need. So you can either construct the JSON like I just did, or you can run this command. So if we go, let's go look real quick at, make sure we created that service principal. So go to Azure Active Directory. We will go to app registrations, and you'll see I have a number 2 created. So that's been created as well. And if we go back to our subscriptions, you'll click on here. We'll click on access control, and we'll see role assignments. And we have both service principals. The one without the number 2 and the one with the number 2 are contributors. So we have the service principals now. So let's go over to Azure DevOps and show you how to add that same service principal to Azure DevOps. So you'll come into your project, and then this is my actual site, my DevOps site for this project. I'll click on Settings, and I'm going to go down to Service Connections, and I'm going to hit New Service Connection. I'm going to do Azure Resource Manager, and then I'm going to click Manual, and I will type in the subscription ID, subscription names. I'll just do this real quick. So we have the subscription ID, subscription name. So I have the name right here. So you can copy this. If you go under subscriptions, you'll see the name right here. So just put that over here. And then we will get the service principal ID. So we need the service principal ID, same as the client ID. It says client ID underneath the description. We will get the tenant. We'll need the tenant ID. I also need the secret, which is important. Come over here and do the secret. And then you'll have to give it a service connection name. I'm going to give it the same name as my GitHub secret just to keep things consistent. So I'll call this Azure Credentials, and I can hit verify and save. So it should verify this and save it as a service principal. So now you have this service principal set up in GitHub Actions and in Azure Pipelines. So I'm going to touch base on how you should do this with good security. So we did create a service principal. We did it the portal via CLI. We granted access, we placed it in GitHub, and we placed it in Azure Pipelines. So chances are IT is not going to give you full subscription access. What will actually happen in a real organization is IT will create a resource group. So they'll create a resource group here, and we'll create one, and we'll just call this test. So we'll call this test for our dev environment, and we'll hit review and create, and they'll hit create here. So it should just take a second. We'll go to the resource group, and if we come over here, we can actually click on add role assignment, and we would see the same service principal. So you'd have a contributor, and then we would pick our Databricks service principal action and hit save. So now we have access to just this resource group. So in reality, what you will probably have is you'd have a resource group called in my case, I'll call it Databricks Dev Ops. Uh, and then you'll probably have a dev resource group, and then you'd have a QA resource group. So we'd have 3 resource groups. So you'd probably have DevOps, you'd have QA, and you'd have production. So these resource groups would each be tied to a service principal. And then if your service principal was called Azure Credentials, I would name this service principal dash dev, and then create a service principal called dash QA, and then a service principal called dash prod. So you'd have a naming schema that's consistent. I'll show you why in my pipeline. Typically, I know my connection name and I append my environment I'm deploying to. And this service principal could be pointing to a dev Azure subscription. So it doesn't have to be pointing to the same subscription. These could all be in different subscriptions. So lots of times you have 3 different subscriptions, one for dev, one for production, and one for QA. So you have 3 service principals named. I would name them typically the same thing, and then append the environment that you're going to. And then when the pipeline's running, it will just simply connect to this one, and when it pushes out the resources, they'll go to your dev subscription. So you can have 3 resource groups in one subscription here. If you're going to put them in the same subscription, you would need a suffix. If you put these in different subscriptions, you could have the same resource group name going to 3 different subscriptions. So depends upon your naming standards, but you will need 3 connections to go to 3 different subscriptions. So that's all for now, and next we'll start talking about how to deploy our pipeline using these service principals.